the constitution that I grew up with essentially was the 1968 constitution. I grew up in the sense that although I was already 15 years old, 14 years old when that came through, it was the constitution that really I first became conscious of. Undoubtedly, that constitution was condescending in the sense that the United Kingdom retained enormous amounts of power under it, and it was condescending in the sense that whatever was given to the local legislature was provided by way of, you may do this, but don't overstep the mark because we retain enormous amounts of power under this constitution. So in that sense, if colonies exist today, which I believe they don't, it's a different relationship, it was very much a colonial constitution. The reality is that between 1968 and 2006, when we got the new constitution, in practice, the system of government in Gibraltar moved forward substantially, and the letter of the law, as written in the 1968 constitution, had been overcome by practice. It had been overcome by the reality that there was less and less interference from the United Kingdom and more power and discretion exercised by the Gibraltar Parliament and Gibraltar government. To a large degree, it was by concession and by practice rather than by the letter of the law. It became obvious, and I believe our politicians were very aware for many, many years before 2006, that there was a need to update and revamp and make the constitution and have a new constitution and create a new relationship with the United Kingdom. There was a process which took a number of years, involving a constitutional committee of Parliament. Certain representations were taken from the public, and then a document was produced and a negotiation ensued with the United Kingdom. The result of it was a 2006 constitution. My own personal objections to it, and I was at the time of the referendum that adopted it the chairman of the No campaign, which was a very loose grouping of people with different viewpoints. We weren't all agreed on the arguments, but we felt that we had to campaign against the yes vote as a group, albeit each one of us retaining our own views in relation to the Constitution. My particular view was that the new Constitution was a perfect, or had been a perfect opportunity to include in it basic principles of democracy, as alluded to by Dicey, who is historically the person who most Western or British-style democracies sort of use as the person who brought out the principles, constitutional principles that should be followed. And one of the basic constitutional principles is a separation of powers between the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive. Throughout time that I remember, and certainly since the 1968 Constitution, there had really been no separation of powers between the executive arm of government and the legislative arm of government, for the simple reason that on the government benches sat the government members of the House of Assembly at the time, now members of Parliament, but all of them were ministers. Therefore, all of them had executive powers. And Dicey said that that was, and I believe is, a recipe for disaster and for autocratic government rather than democratic government. As we all know, the United States of America takes that philosophy to an extreme and has complete separation between executive, legislature and judiciary, albeit there are arguments about appointments to the Supreme Court of America, but that's detail rather than the general principle. In Gibraltar we don't have that. We still don't have it. And that bugbear is something that upsets me tremendously, and which I have always wanted to try and put right ever since I came back from the United Kingdom, from my studies in the United Kingdom 36 years ago. And so over time I took a view that I needed to do something about that, and this has sort of resulted eventually in my writing a blog. It's a blog that's become rather popular in terms of Gibraltar. It's read by 10 to 15% of the electorate, and it has gained a certain amount of influence and impetus in Gib. As a result of that, and because of certain events that freed me up politically that before I wasn't as free to take decisions, I have indicated that I might well be prepared to stand for election as an independent candidate to Parliament with 14 principles. Most of them are, and the majority of which shouldn't be controversial. They're all based on good governance issues, filling the democratic deficit and reforming the electoral system and parliamentary system. And that's really where I come from in that regard. In terms of the Constitution, it was adopted. I think it was missold to the electorate as a decolonising constitution. I don't think it decolonises Gibraltar. I always use the example that in the last schedule of the Constitution, the last paragraph of that schedule says, despite everything that we give you in this Constitution, we, the United Kingdom, can take it away whenever we want. So in that sense, it's not a decolonising constitution. It is not a constitution that provides self-determination, because we were not given the choice. We were given the choice of either accept this constitution or don't accept it and stay with the old one. So that is not a self-determining choice. There was no question of independence, or no question of integration with Britain. There was no other of the issues that had to be determined in if one was going to exercise the right of self-determination. So in that sense, it wasn't an act of self-determination. In that sense, it was missold. Is it important to me? No, because I think the world has moved on. I think the word colony is anachronistic. I think really relationships between countries are very different. I think we are treated as grown up and self-governing by the United Kingdom, and I think that is the reality of it, and that is what is important. The other reality is that having agreed to the 2006 Constitution just 3 or 4 years ago, it's very unlikely the United Kingdom is going to sit around the table and renegotiate a new constitution for another 20, 30, 40 years. So we are where we are, and I think it's time that politicians stopped using both Spain and constitutional arguments as a distraction to real politics. And real politics is about what we do to govern Gibraltar and how we govern Gibraltar. And I'm hopeful that with my blog and with the little bits that I'm doing, I will draw attention to that reality and have good government rather than just distractions from good government.